How did a Muslim baby bring light to a Hindu village? A spiritual tale of innocence, unity, and divine mercy. In a hidden corner of rural India, where time drifts as slowly as temple bells echoing through morning mist, there was a small village called Roshanpur. There, the brown earth smelled of sun and dung, barefoot children ran on dusty red roads, and temple bells coexisted with the call to azan, yet the two never truly touched. And in that place of quiet intersection lived a poor couple, Aman and Ziba. They stayed in an old mud house under an ancient mango tree, its roof patched with faded nylon sheets. Nothing about them was remarkable except one thing: they had been married for over 8 years and had never had a child. Ziba, her eyes as deep as a dry well, would sit at the doorway each dawn, prayer beads in hand, her lips whispering small wishes into the silent sky. Aman, returning each night from day labor in town, would stand before a worn-out rug in their humble room, bow his head, and pray only for one thing. "Oh Allah, grant me a child just once." But those prayers dissolved into the air. No reply. No sign. Just silence, a silence sometimes more terrifying than outright rejection. If you're still watching this video and praying for Ziba's wish to come true, please comment 1 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't yet subscribed, I encourage you to hit subscribe and turn on the bell icon, so you don't miss a single story. Your support helps us keep creating content that informs and inspires. Time is like a blunt knife, slowly carving away at their faith. Roshanpur, a village where people appeared united but drew invisible lines with whispered words, began to look at Ziba with a mix of pity and suspicion. "Maybe she's cursed," said some neighbors behind her back. "If she followed a different faith, perhaps she would have been blessed by now." One day, a Hindu woman in a blazing red sari sneered as Ziba passed. "If you changed your religion, maybe you'd have a child by now." Ziba heard, but didn't respond. Only her eyes, silent, patient, gazed into the distance, where the sky and the earth no longer had borders. This story would have been heartbreaking if it ended there. But no. Every long silence eventually roars like a drum in the night. One night, as the moonlight bathed their cracked walls in silver, Aman woke from a strange dream. In it, he saw a child whispering unfamiliar words, not crying, not singing, but something in between that clenched his heart. He sat up alone in the dark. And for the first time in years, he didn't beg for a child. Instead, he whispered, "If this is my karma to bear, then please grant me the strength to endure without bitterness. But if you have mercy, knock on my heart once with the cry of a child." The next morning, Ziba came down with a fever. No one knew why. Aman rushed her to the only hospital around, Satyanarayan Hospital, a place many Muslims avoided due to the cold reception they often received. In the rundown waiting room, thick with antiseptic and static from old speakers, a thunderbolt of news arrived. "Congratulations, your wife is pregnant," the doctor announced, without a smile. "But be careful. This is a high-risk pregnancy." Aman said nothing. He simply looked up. And for the first time in years he cried, not in prayer, but in gratitude. Ziba carried her pregnancy like a fragile miracle. Each month was a tug of war between hope and fear. Sunny days brought faith, windy days brought dread. But something curious happened. The village began to change. An old Hindu woman, Gangabai, who once avoided Ziba, now placed her hand gently on Ziba's forehead. "Don't be afraid, young mother. No matter the religion, every child is a light to the world." Ziba teared up. Not because the words were beautiful, but because, for the first time, someone from a different faith had prayed for her with a full heart. As the 9th month neared, money became a nightmare, The doctor warned, this could require surgery and it won't be cheap. Aman sold what little they had, borrowed from anyone who would listen, and even knelt before those who once saw him as an outsider. Some helped. Some didn't. But he never gave up. Because this time, he wasn't just praying for a child, he was praying that the miracle wouldn't vanish in silence. And then that night came. Heavy rain. Muddy roads. Ziba cried out in pain. Aman took her to the hospital on a rickety cart, under a downpour that felt like the sky was weeping with them. In the middle of the night, amid whispered prayers and indifferent stares from Hindu nurses, a child was born. And he didn't cry. He spoke. No one could quite tell what it was. But soft syllables escaped his tiny lips. Allahu Akbar. Like an echo traveling far, seeping through walls that had once divided people. In the stillest moment of that rainy night, under dim lights and the clinking of surgical tools, the baby didn't wail. Didn't scream. Instead, a series of broken yet rhythmic sounds emerged from his fragile throat. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't speech. But anyone who heard it felt something sacred, a vibration that seemed to carry a soul's pure prayer. Allah, you. Akbar. A Hindu nurse nearby dropped her blood pressure monitor. An elderly doctor froze, breathing hard, then whispered, I've never heard a newborn make a sound like that. Aman, the new father, hands trembling, eyes red, stepped closer. He looked at his newborn son, wrapped in a blood-stained white cloth. And in his gaze was a strange fear. Was that really the azan? Or just some bizarre trick of nature? He couldn't know. No one could. But this child, without being taught, without being prompted, had spoken the name of God with his very first breath. Rumors spread faster than the monsoon winds. A Muslim baby had been born uttering something like the azan in a Hindu hospital, surrounded by Hindu doctors and nurses. Some called it a miracle. Others said it was hallucination. But crowds gathered as if they needed to witness the truth for themselves. By the next morning, the hospital resembled a silent marketplace. An elderly Hindu woman sat cross-legged outside the maternity ward, muttering, "If he's truly been blessed, maybe he belongs to God, not just to one religion." A father caring for his sick child in the next room whispered to a nurse, "What do you think? Is he some avatar? Or a reborn prophet?" The nurse didn't answer. But her gaze drifted toward the room where Ziba lay, cradling her son, where silence hummed like a sacred hymn. Aman hadn't slept in 2 days. He sat outside the room, eyes fixed on his child, asleep on Ziba's chest. Every twitch startled him, as if afraid the miracle might vanish if he blinked too long. Ziba was different. She said nothing. But within her silence bloomed an entire universe. Her eyes, dry for years, now brimmed with tears, not of sorrow, but of a rare kind of peace. The kind of peace that comes only when you touch something truly divine, something you once only dared to dream of. News of the baby who recited the azan reached Roshanpur like lightning. And those who came to congratulate them weren't just Muslims. Even some Hindus who once scorned the poor couple now came awkwardly to their door. "We just wanted to see him with our own eyes." Aman turned no one away. He was no longer angry. No longer bitter. Because deep down, he too was searching for a meaning larger than himself. And then someone unexpected arrived, Rakesh Malhotra, a wealthy Hindu businessman from the region. He had come to the hospital to visit his premature granddaughter when he overheard the mysterious azan-like sound coming from the next room. Malhotra, a man who had never believed in anything but the money in his pocket, stood frozen at the half-open door. And for a fleeting moment, he felt his heart skip a beat. He asked for the couple's names. Later, without a word to them, he paid their entire hospital bill, leaving no trace of his identity. When Aman found out, he went still. Then quietly knelt on his prayer rug, hand over his heart. "O Allah, if this is how you answer, then I bow my head in surrender." That night, as Ziba lulled her baby to sleep with the soft whisper, "La ilaha illallah," the child unexpectedly made a tiny sound, faint, broken, but distinct. Akbar. Ziba gasped and held her baby closer. And in that humble clay room, for the first time, there was light, not from a lamp, but from the rebirth of faith. No one in Roshanpur, regardless of faith, could deny that Aman's child had changed something in the village's air. The suspicious glances were gone. The whispers about the cursed couple faded. In their place lingered something no one could quite name, a quiet reverence, and perhaps, the fragile spark of new belief. On the third day after the baby's birth, Imam Sahib, the spiritual leader of the village's Muslim community, came to visit Ziba. Known for his calm demeanor and rare displays of emotion, the Imam sat beside the child's bed for a long time, fingers moving along his prayer beads, eyes damp. "What is the boy's name?" he asked gently. "We haven't named him yet," Aman answered, a bit embarrassed. "Then let me suggest one. Call him Nur Muhammad, for the light of God shines within him." That name spread like a song. People no longer referred to him as the boy who recited the Azan, but by his full name, with reverence, Nur Muhammad, the light of Muhammad. Ziba nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't know what that name would mean for her son's life, only that it was the first time she'd heard her child's name spoken as a blessing. Soon after, something seemingly unrelated happened, but it marked a turning point. One afternoon, as Ziba returned from the local clinic, an elderly Hindu man, weathered, in faded clothes, stood at her door, nervously asking to see Nur. "My name is Gopal. My son is sick. People say, your child might offer a prayer." Ziba said nothing. She quietly stepped inside and brought the baby out. Nur was asleep. But when Gopal saw him, he suddenly fell to his knees, not out of religious obligation, but because something in him cracked, and was healed, just by looking at the child. That night, Gopal told his wife, "I don't know why, but when I saw that baby, all my fear vanished. So did my anger. All I wanted was to kneel and apologize for every time I looked down on them just because they were of another faith." The next morning, Gopal's son, the one the doctor said had no hope, suddenly woke up. His fever was gone. Gopal returned to Aman's house, this time not to ask for prayers, but to offer a gift, a bouquet of lotus flowers. "From the pond in my village, where no Muslim has ever been allowed to draw water. Today, I bring it, as a token of gratitude." That small event sparked like fire among dry straw. Soon, Aman's home became a place where Hindus and Muslims entered together, without hesitation. Some came out of curiosity. Some came to pray. Some didn't believe at all, they simply came, to sit quietly and listen to the breath of a child they believed was whispering something greater than himself. The following month, when the Akikah, the Thanksgiving ceremony for a Muslim child's birth, was held, something unprecedented occurred. More Hindus attended than Muslims. Imam Sahib, initially reserved, sat beside Pandit Ramesh, the elder Hindu priest, beneath the same canopy. Neither of them spoke. They simply watched together, as little Nur slept peacefully in his mother's arms. Midway through the event, as trays of lamb and curry were brought out, Aman did something that stunned everyone. He brought out separate trays, meatless dishes of lentils, vegetables, and rice, and placed them before the Hindu guests. "These are for our visitors from across the temple," he said, his voice trembling but clear. "Because today, this home belongs not to any one faith, but to gratitude." For a rare moment, silence fell. And then, applause. No one had imagined that in a village once fractured by religion, there could ever be a feast of such unity, all because of a child not yet a month old. At the end of the ceremony, just as guests were preparing to leave, Nur began to stir. And, just like at the hospital, the baby uttered a string of strange, broken, yet resonant sounds. "Allah, you Akbar." No one spoke. No one disrupted the moment. Because sometimes, truth doesn't need to be explained. It only needs to be witnessed, and believed. While most of Roshanpur's villagers began to see Aman and Zeba's family with new eyes, there was still one man standing on the margins, his gaze darkening whenever the name Nur Muhammad was mentioned. His name was Jairam, a local construction supplier, known for his arrogance, stubbornness, and deep religious prejudice. To Jairam, the world was split in two, Hindus and the others. And the others, in his mind, were always a threat. When news of the newborn reciting the azan spread, he sneered. "Nonsense. Just a trick to beg for donations." But the story wouldn't go away. More and more people, including devout Hindus, began visiting Aman's home, speaking of the baby's strange eyes, the peace they felt hearing his whispers during sleep, the sight of Muslims and Hindus sharing a meal under one roof. It all irritated Jairam more than the summer heat. He began spreading rumors. "They've probably hidden a recorder under the baby's shirt. It's all a stunt. These people want to turn our village into some melting pot of religions. We can't let that happen." One afternoon, Jairam showed up at Aman's house with two young men, easily swayed by his rhetoric. Zeba was inside, soothing Nur to sleep. Aman was fixing a door hinge. Jairam stood in the yard, arms crossed. "Bring the kid out. I want to hear him cry his so-called azan." Aman stood, wiped the sweat from his brow, and replied calmly. "Brother Jairam, if you've come to understand, you're welcome inside. But if you're here to mock, I ask you, let my wife and child be." There was no anger in his voice, no sarcasm, but the words left Jairam speechless. He hadn't yet responded when a faint sound rose from inside the house. Not a sharp wail, but a steady, low hum, as if a sacred verse was being called from the very earth itself. "Allahu Akbar." The two young men who came with Jairam froze. One turned to the other and whispered, Did you hear that? It's like, it didn't even come from the baby." Jairam frowned. He stepped closer to the house, peeking through a gap in the curtain. Zeba was rocking the child gently, her lips moving in silent prayer, while the baby whispered softly in his sleep. And in that fleeting moment, Jairam felt something fall out of place in his chest, like a piece of the hardened wall he'd built around his heart had been quietly chipped away. He turned and left without saying a word. That entire night, he couldn't sleep. In a restless dream, he wandered through a forest where hundreds of children sat chanting. At the center stood one child, facing him, hand outstretched as if beckoning him forward. He took a step only to be stopped by an invisible force. He awoke drenched in sweat. 2 days later, Jairam returned, this time alone. It was late afternoon, and Aman's family was preparing a vegetarian meal for a few visiting Hindu guests. Ziba stepped outside, surprised but smiling. "Hello, Jairam. Please, come in." Jairam didn't enter. He looked at the baby lying peacefully in a bamboo cradle on the porch, his face calm like a crescent moon, long eyelashes fluttering with each breath. Nothing happened. No azan. No glow of divine light. Just a baby, asleep. Jairam stood silently. Then, unprompted, he spoke. I don't know what I believe. But I feel lighter when I'm here." Aman stepped out from the kitchen, gently placed a hand on Jairam's shoulder. No more words were needed. The silence was enough. The next day, Jairam went to the Hindu temple to pray. But on his way home, he took a detour to Masjid-e-Nur, the mosque that the villagers had recently built in memory of Nur Muhammad. No one stopped him. No one asked what religion he followed. Because there, the light did not choose a faith, it simply sought hearts willing to open. The news of Jairam, the man who once mocked and hated, quietly stepping into Masjid-e-Nur, spread through Roshanpur like a gentle wind. Not because it was shocking, but because people began to believe that a sincere heart could soften like soil after rain. Since that afternoon, Jairam no longer spoke about the child. He neither praised nor denied. But he began to listen. He began to hold the gaze of those he once avoided. And the strangest thing, the very people who used to echo his prejudice now looked at him more kindly than ever before. One misty morning, Jairam came to visit Aman. It wasn't a formal visit. It was something deeper, a quiet opening of the heart. He sat down on the earthen porch without ceremony and said, "I used to believe, if someone wasn't like me, they had to be wrong. But maybe I was wrong. I didn't see the child with my eyes. I saw him with my heart." Aman didn't respond immediately. He poured tea, offered warm flatbread, then looked directly at the man who had once cast a long shadow over his family. "You weren't wrong. You just were never given the chance to hear the answer." They sat in silence. Inside, Ziba was softly humming a lullaby to Nur. The tune was unknown, but each note felt like a blessing for anyone willing to pause and truly listen. That conversation became a turning point. No one announced it. No one recorded it. But it marked a new dawn for Roshanpur, a place once divided by cold religious boundaries that now began to thaw with quiet understanding. Then came another test, not from people this time, but from illness. Nur, the beloved child of the village, suddenly developed a high fever. It started mildly. But by the third day, his lips were blue, his eyes dry, his tongue parched. Ziba panicked. Aman was overwhelmed. They rushed him to Satyanarayan Hospital, the same place where he had once uttered his first azan. If you're still watching this video and praying for Nur's well-being, please comment the number 5 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed, I highly encourage you to do so and turn on the bell icon, so you never miss a story. Your support helps us continue to create meaningful, inspiring content. The news of Nur's hospitalization spread quickly. No longer was it just a few villagers visiting, it became streams of people, from neighboring towns and dusty paths that had never before led to this little home. In the narrow hospital hallway, Hindus and Muslims stood side by side, hands clasped, heads bowed in prayer, each in their own way, but all asking for the same thing. Please, don't take this light away too soon. A scene no one had ever imagined unfolded. Jairam and Rakesh Malhotra, the wealthy businessman who once quietly paid Aman's hospital bills, stood together in the ICU waiting room. No words passed between them. but both stood with folded hands. One murmured Namah Shivaya, the other whispered Bismillah. Two faiths. One prayer. That night, Ziba nearly collapsed. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. She sat by the glass of the isolation room, fingers clinging to her worn prayer beads, her lips trembling with words that felt like threads tying her soul to the child lying still inside. Aman sat beside her. He didn't cry. But his eyes looked as if they had cried all the tears of a past life. If you take him, I won't ask why, he whispered. But please, let him speak one last time, in the language you once placed upon his lips. And then, in the middle of the night, a soft breeze passed through the hospital corridor. No one knew where it came from. But carried within it was a sound strange, sacred like a string instrument humming through a desert. Allahu Akbar. No one knew where the voice came from. A nurse rushed into the ICU. When she came out, she didn't speak. She simply placed her hand over her heart and shook her head gently. Nur was gone. Ziba collapsed. She hadn't even held him one last time. Aman turned away, but couldn't hide the sob escaping his chest. Jairam stood motionless. Then slowly, he knelt. He folded his hands not in the Hindu way, not in the Muslim way, but like a man mourning the loss of the first child his spirit had ever embraced. Rakesh Malhotra wiped his tears. No one in that room could stand upright anymore. But no one wailed. Because deep down, they knew the child had not died. He had fulfilled his purpose. The next morning, at the funeral held at Masjid-e-Nur, many Hindus came. Some brought garlands. Some stood silently. A few Hindu women removed their bangles, a traditional sign of mourning, as if that child had been their own flesh and blood. Imam Sahib, choking on his final prayer, said, "Some children are born to live. But some are born to awaken the hearts of adults." And so, beneath the soft sunlight, watched by hundreds of silent eyes, Nur Muhammad, the first child in Roshanpur to ever utter the azan with his very first breath, was laid to rest. After Nur Muhammad left this world, Roshanpur fell into a long silence, not the tragic kind of mourning, but a deep stillness, like the surface of a lake after the moon slips behind the mountains. Inside every villager's heart, regardless of faith, echoed the same quiet question. How could a child change an entire village? And in that question, each person found a fragment of themselves. Nur's small grave sat just to the left of Masjid-e-Nur, the place where Hindus and Muslims first shared a meal together. There was no grand headstone, no monument, just a simple white stone engraved with a humble line. Nur Muhammad, the light that came to soothe the darkness. People came every day to visit. Not in crowds. No ceremonies. Just quiet footsteps and soft prayers. Especially in the early mornings before the mist had lifted, children could sometimes be heard whispering near the grave, as if playing with the soul of a friend who never had the chance to grow up. One day, Jairam showed up at Aman's house unannounced. He brought with him a hand-drawn design. "I think it's time to build a place where people aren't divided by their faiths. A place to remember compassion." Aman looked at the drawing. It was a simple structure, a tiled roof house, no crosses, no crescent moons, no Buddha statues. Just an open circle in the center of 4 open walls, where anyone could sit down and listen no matter what language they prayed in. Ziba listened to the idea in silence. Then she said something that stunned both men. That place should be called the Temple Between Two Worlds. Construction began just weeks later. Strangely, no one had to ask for donations. People simply showed up with bricks, with shovels, with bundles of bamboo and bags of cement. A Hindu man hauled water. A Muslim mixed mortar. A Sikh grandmother cooked lunch for the workers, while two Catholic boys from the next village came to help because they'd heard it was being built to honor a child who called out God's name. The structure took exactly 49 days to complete, the same number of days, in Buddhist tradition, that a soul needs to transcend. On the final day, the sun was gentle. A breeze swept in through the curtainless windows, carrying the scent of fresh rice fields mixed with construction dust, a scent both raw and alive. There was no official ceremony. No speeches. But everyone was part of it. Imam Sahib, Pandit Ramesh, Jairam, Rakesh Malhotra, and Aman all sat in a circle on the newly laid grass mat. In that peaceful silence, a 6-year-old Hindu girl named Lajo stepped into the center, raised her hand, and asked, "Uncle, if I recite the azan, will God be angry?" No one laughed. No one scolded her. Pandit Ramesh smiled and nodded. "If you call with your whole heart, then anyone, any God will smile back at you." Lajo closed her eyes, pursed her lips. No one knew if she truly remembered the words. But in the cool breeze, they heard her whisper, "Allah, you. AK." No one cared whether she pronounced it correctly. Because in that moment, the entire temple and the whole village belonged to another world. A world where people listened to each other with their hearts, not their scriptures. From then on, the temple between two worlds became the most extraordinary place in Roshanpur. On Monday mornings, Hindu school children came to read Tagore poems. On Wednesday evenings, elderly Muslims sat quietly, reflecting on Quranic verses. Sometimes a Christian recited hymns in Hindi. Other times, an atheist just sat still, and breathed. No one saw this as wrong. There were no holy texts. No sermons. But there were tears wiped away, and hands held between people who once couldn't look each other in the eye. And outside the entrance, a scorched wooden sign was hung. No one knew who carved it, but everyone who read it went quiet. Here, religion is not the answer but the question through which we learn to love. There were no storms in Roshanpur that season. But the hearts of the people trembled. One gray afternoon near the end of March, with winds that rattled rooftops, a rumor spread like wildfire. A group of outsiders is planning to destroy the temple between two worlds. They were strangers, seen by market vendors. They called themselves defenders of pure faith, opposing any blending of religions. They weren't from the government. They had no paperwork. But they had loud voices. And if those voices weren't stopped, they would shatter everything Nur had left behind. That evening, the village council called an emergency meeting for the first time in decades. Under flickering oil lamps, anxious faces gathered: Rakesh Malhotra, Jairam, Imam Sahib, Pandit Ramesh. And in a quiet corner sat Aman, a man with nothing left to lose, yet carrying the invisible wealth of memory, the legacy of Nur. Ziba didn't attend. But before Aman left, she placed her hand on his and whispered, "If they want to destroy it, let them. But don't let them erase what our son left behind, the gentleness in people's hearts." Aman nodded. But he knew. Sometimes, to protect what is gentle, you must become firm. At the meeting, the arguments were fierce. Some wanted to compromise. Maybe, just take down the sign. Call it a community center instead. But then, for the first time, Jairam spoke. And his voice echoed like a drum in the village square. "When I was blind with hatred, I wanted to tear down others' homes. But this place taught me to bow my head. If we let them destroy it now, then we've become blind again. The room fell silent. Not because Jairam was eloquent, but because everyone saw a piece of themselves in his words. Once afraid, once angry, but somehow healed. Imam Sahib looked around the room. Then he said slowly, "That child recited the first azan in a Hindu hospital. This temple is the second azan. Not spoken through the mouth but through action. We cannot let anyone silence the light." No one objected. The council voted unanimously. The temple between two worlds must remain. Not in the name of any religion, but in the name of truth in the human heart. 3 days later, the outsiders came. They arrived on motorcycles, wearing plain uniforms, carrying loudspeakers and banners that read, "No tolerance for multi-faith temples. This is heresy." They chanted. They slammed their fists on the temple walls. Some villagers grew afraid and stepped back. But a group stayed rooted in place. Jairam, Aman, Rakesh, Pandit Ramesh, and several Hindu mothers holding their infants. No one shouted back. No one retaliated. They simply stood like a wall made of belief. The man with the loudspeaker shouted, "This is an insult to true faith. Who gave you permission to build a place of worship that belongs to no one?" And then from somewhere within the crowd, a small voice rose. It was Lajo, the little girl who once asked, "Will God be angry if I recite the azan?" "Sir, this place belongs to all of us. Because here, I can hear Allah and Krishna without getting punished." The crowd went still. The man with the loudspeaker lowered his arm. A woman beside him tugged at his sleeve and whispered, "Did you see that girl's eyes? There's something in them. I just can't bring myself to yell anymore." And so, they withdrew. No protests. No violence. No destruction. Just quietly turning away like sleepwalkers waking from a long, strange dream. That night, Zibo lit a small lamp at Nur's grave. No flowers. No offerings. Only a pale golden glow cast onto the simple white stone where the words were carved. The light that came to soothe the darkness. Aman sat beside her in silence. But Ziba knew, in him a prayer had been spoken, wordlessly. "Oh Allah, if that light once left in a storm, then tonight, it has returned in silence." From that stormy night on, Roshanpur was never the same village again. No newspaper wrote about it. No TV crew filmed a segment. But anyone who passed through even just for a drink of water from the well at noon could feel something had changed. A village that had learned to bow its head when speaking of one another, and to raise it high when speaking of a child. People spoke of Nur in their own ways. When a Hindu mother had a gravely ill child, she would place her hand on the child's forehead and whisper, "Nur, if you can hear me, please pray for us." When a young Muslim man left for the city to find work, his mother didn't cry. Instead, she lit a candle at Nur's grave and said, "Send him some of your light, the same light you once gave to us." When a young couple, a Hindu woman and a Muslim man, chose to marry despite family opposition, they stood for hours at the temple between two worlds, before the wall with no symbols, and said, "We'll name our child Nur, whether it's a boy or girl." In a quiet corner of the village, a widowed woman named Sabina, once rejected by both communities for performing Hindu cremation rites for her husband, also visited Nur's grave. She knelt, but didn't cry. Her eyes were dry, like a mirror. "You're the only one in this village everyone believes in. Even without breath, your words still live. Show them that forgiveness is not a sin." That night, two mothers, one Hindu, one Muslim, came to apologize to Sabina. No one told them to. They simply couldn't sleep without doing so. And then came the festival season. That year, Diwali and Maulid, the Prophet Muhammad's birthday, fell in the same week. The village didn't know which to celebrate first. Finally, a little girl, Jairam's daughter, raised her hand during the community meeting and said, "Why not celebrate both? Like it's Nur's birthday. Because if it weren't for Nur, we wouldn't all be sitting together like this." No one laughed. Everyone nodded. And so the celebration happened. Diwali lanterns hung across Masjid-e-Nur. Maulid garlands draped over the doors of the Krishna temple. Hindus lit candles, Muslims brought trays of sweets. Children wore sparkling clothes, holding drawings of a smiling child. No one asked them to draw that. There was no assignment. But every child said, "We drew our friend, Nur." That night, Aman stood on the edge of the celebration, silent. He didn't mingle with the crowd. But his tears fell when a small Hindu boy ran up to him, hugged his leg, and said, "Uncle, are you Nur's dad? My mom said if it weren't for you, my parents wouldn't have been allowed to get married." Aman bent down and embraced the child. And in that moment, his lost son came alive again like a wind moving through his chest. Ziba didn't attend that night. She stayed indoors, reading the Quran by lamplight. But near midnight, after the festival ended, a group of people gathered outside her home. They didn't knock. They just stood there in silence. Then, an elderly Hindu man who had once called Ziba an outsider stepped forward and placed a small wooden plaque at her doorstep. Carved into it, in both Devanagari and Arabic, were the words, "The house of the one who gave birth to light." Ziba came out, eyes wide, not in surprise, but because she was witnessing the very thing she once prayed for. Not to have a child, but to ensure her child was never forgotten. From that day on, people came to their home not to ask about religion, but simply to sit. Some came to drink from the well where Nur had first been bathed. Others came to touch the old cradle, still kept in the corner like a silent witness. One day, someone asked Aman, "Do you ever wish Nur had lived longer?" He answered slowly, "If someone lives long and does nothing, what's the point? My son lived only 6 years. But in that time, he taught adults to bow, elders to apologize, and enemies to smile. To live like that was a full life already." That night, Roshanpur's skies held no wind, no rain. But inside Ziba, quiet storms never ceased. Each night, she lay facing the old cradle, now empty for years. The soft blanket that once wrapped her child was still folded neatly. Sometimes the faint scent of breast milk drifted through the room like a mirage, startling Ziba awake, as if her child were still breathing gently by her ear. Nearly 2 years had passed since Nur Muhammad returned to the Most High. But Ziba had never once dreamed of him. Not because she didn't remember, but perhaps because her longing ran too deep. So deep that her mind dared not dig, for fear of touching a light that once blazed and vanished like a falling star. That night, after finishing her Quran recitation, Ziba placed her hand over her heart and whispered, "If you're truly in a place of peace, let me see you just once. Not so I can hold on, but so I know you've forgiven me for letting you go." Aman, sitting nearby, looked up at his wife. But he said nothing, because he understood. Every mother holds private conversations with a child who has passed, and a good husband knows not to interrupt. That night, Ziba dreamed. In her dream, she stood in a vast field white as milk. No paths. No trees. Only a silvery light spread across the horizon. Not blinding. Not dim. But gentle like the first hug of a mother. She turned, searching. No wind. No voices. And then, a pair of small feet dashed past, leaving glowing footprints in the earth. Ziba didn't need to see the face. She knew it was Nur. The boy stood just a few meters away, still wearing the same white kurta as before, soft hair falling across his forehead, his eyes deep as if they held the whole night sky. But this time, those eyes weren't filled with the sacredness that others had spoken of, only the pure innocence of a son looking at his mother. Ziba knelt down, her hands trembling, but she couldn't reach him. Some invisible distance still stood between them, like a mist between two worlds. Are you angry with me?" she asked, her voice barely holding together. Nur didn't speak. He took one step forward, then placed his small hand over his chest. And when that hand opened, light poured out like warm water, washing over Ziba. In that moment, she understood. Not with her mind, but with a mother's soul. She knew her child wasn't angry, wasn't blaming, wasn't sad. Because Nur had never lived like an ordinary child. He was a beam of light, sent to stir the darkness, and return. Ziba cried in her dream. But when she awoke, her eyes were dry. No more tears. Only a smile. A smile soft as incense at dawn. Aman saw that face and paused. "You saw him?" Ziba nodded, for the first time not hiding her pain. But instead of telling every detail, she simply said, "He told me, light never dies. It only moves house." From that day on, Ziba changed. She no longer shrank away whenever someone mentioned Nur. No longer avoided the eyes of other children in the village. Instead, she began teaching them to read regardless of who they were or what faith they followed. At first, only 3 or 4 children came. By the end of the week, there were 20. She didn't charge a single coin. They called her Mi Ziba, Mother Ziba. As if they'd all been born from a heart that had learned to embrace pain as an essential part of love. One day, Lajo, the Hindu girl who once recited the azan, came to Ziba after class and asked softly, If I die, will I get to meet Nur?" Ziba pulled her into an embrace and whispered, "If you live with the same heart you have now, then when you die, you won't need to find Nur. Because the light will find you first." That night, under a Roshanpur sky filled with stars, someone placed a small lantern by Nur's grave alongside a school child's note. Scrawled across it, in both Devanagari and Arabic, were these words: "I don't know God's name, but Nur is the most beautiful word I've ever heard." If you're still watching this video and believe that Nur lives on, please comment 9 below to let us know you're here. And if you haven't yet, we encourage you to subscribe and turn on the bell, so you never miss a story that moves the soul. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content that informs, heals, and inspires. That summer, the mango trees bloomed earlier than usual in Roshanpur. The sky was a crisp blue, the clouds white as milk, and the wind blew gently across old mud rooftops. People called it Nur's season. No one gave it an official name. But in their hearts, the month of Nur had become a chapter of memory. Not about death, but about what had come back to life through that child's heart. On the 2nd anniversary of Nur's passing, Ziba prepared a small meal. No meat. No wine. No fancy sweets. Just a few slices of flat bread, a bowl of warm milk, and a bundle of white jasmine. Aman set up chairs on the porch. Neighbors arrived uninvited, unannounced. Hindus, Muslims, and those without a faith. But all carrying a memory of the little boy who never grew up, yet touched the most sacred part of their being. Imam Sahib sat beside Pandit Ramesh. Both bowed their heads. No scripture was read. No ceremony led. Just 1 minute of silence, in which all religions stepped aside to make space for love. Ziba opened a soft cloth and pulled out a faded page. The first scribble Nur had ever written with his left hand. It wasn't clear, but everyone believed it said Allah. She didn't explain. She simply placed it on the table, as proof. My child never learned to read. But light doesn't need a map to find its way. That evening, at the temple between two worlds, the children hosted a storytelling circle. They sat in a ring, each sharing something that had changed since learning about Nur. A Hindu boy said, "I used to be scared to visit my Muslim friend's house. Now I go every day to eat Auntie Ziba snacks." A Muslim girl whispered, "My mom told me, if someone does something kind even if they don't pray like we do, you should still bow your head and thank them." Then, unexpectedly, Lajo stood up and raised her hand. "I don't know who God is. But I know when someone makes me feel peaceful, I'm close to him." No one clapped. No one cheered. Because in that moment, everyone was swallowing tears and praying the light would never fade. A few months later, a group of visitors from the city came to Roshanpur. They were journalists, professors, filmmakers. People who had heard of the story of the boy who recited the Azan, and the village that no longer separated by faith. They took notes, photos, videos. One of them asked Aman, "Would you like a statue made of your son? We can get funding, build a peace center in his name." Aman smiled softly and said, "My son never wanted a statue. He just wanted people to sit a little closer together." Then he pointed to a simple stone wall behind the temple, where someone had once written in chalk, "Light doesn't need a name." And so, no statue was built. No peace center launched. But Roshanpur became the center of something greater, awakening. People didn't come to take photos. They came to sit in silence, to feel the wind pass through bricks once laid by both Hindus and Muslims, to read notes written by children in two scripts but sharing one belief. Years later, when Ziba had grown old, her hair gray as ash, her vision misty as dawn, she still sat each morning on the porch, prayer beads in hand, gazing in the direction of her son's grave. Someone once asked her, "Do you wish for anything else in life, besides your child?" Ziba shook her head slowly. "I don't wish for more children. I only wish that every person born carries a little of his light. And if that light is strong enough, it will shine even into the darkest parts of the human heart." In her final moments, as Ziba lay on her deathbed, no machines, no 4 tubes, only Aman holding her hand. She whispered like wind, "I see him, running toward me. Still in white, still calling someone's name. But this time, not Allah. He's saying, 'Am I?'" Aman tightened his grip. Her eyes closed. The light wasn't dazzling. There was no grand farewell. Only an ending peaceful. Like a child returning home to his mother's arms. They say that whenever thunder rumbles over Roshanpur, and the rain stops, and the sun breaks through, if you stand before Nur's grave and close your eyes, you might hear a faint sound in the distance. No one knows whether it's an azan, a lullaby, or just the wind. But if you are quiet enough, you'll understand. Light doesn't need a name. And sometimes, it chooses a child to remind the world of what adults forget. That the world is not divided by religion, but by whether the heart still knows how to love. Thank you for joining us today. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share one thing this story taught you, and how you'll carry it into your life. Your voice matters. Reading your reflections brings strength, healing, and inspiration to us all. If this story moved your heart, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us continue crafting stories that awaken the soul. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.